Most people think that you take an Old Testament text, you read it, you put it next to the life of Jesus, and there's just kind of a one-to-one, straight kind of prediction thing going on. I actually think it's more complicated and more interesting than that, in that there usually is a precursor event in history that God has put in the time of the author that pictures or represents or patterns, what we often call typology, what eventually happens in Jesus Christ, but to a heightened degree.
We really want the interaction. The important thing here in the Counterpoints series is the interaction between the persons. And I said, well, there'd be persons of different points of view. Oh yeah, they said, we have it. But we really want you, and we've decided without your presence, the project won't have as much fun, because you represent the point of view that says that the Old Testament really was pointing to the death and burial and resurrection of Christ, whereas others are saying it's the New Testament that reinterprets the Old to say that. Well, I said, now you've got my juices going. I said, no, if it wasn't there originally, it doesn't have apologetic value for the future. So how are you going to try to convince Jewish audiences that Yeshua, Jesus, is the Messiah if it wasn't there originally? I mean, if you're just retrojecting that back, we call that eisegesis, reading into the text rather than reading out of the text. So I said, okay, I'm on.
Who has not thought about the difference between a God in the Old Testament who seems to kill people with regularity, and then we have the Gospels and Jesus saying something very different. How do we bring those two things together? I think they can be. I think they have to be brought together. But a book like this actually, it begins looking at different ways of how that very important and central theological question is addressed. The best place for Christians to start is actually with the New Testament, because the New Testament does that already. The New Testament actually tries to address the question of, now that Jesus has come, what about our Bible? What about what we call the Old Testament? And the three views given there are three evangelical attempts, which are representative of sort of broader things happening in evangelicalism, but three attempts to try to answer that, I think, central question for evangelical Christians.
The three of us critique each other, so we have an opportunity to come back and say, now I like this about your essay, but I think this needs to be improved. What a wonderful way for students to join in the conversation. So rather than giving a straight line, here are three lines, but lines that critique each other. Wouldn't it be wonderful if every teacher could have three visiting lectures on the topic of the New Testament use of the Old? And what a hotter topic than this one of New Testament use of the Old. I don't know of anything right now on the scene of biblical and theological studies that is a greater issue than this issue. So I warmly commend it to you.
In my first presentation to the Evangelical Theological Society, the first person to ask me a question in the presentation was Walt Kaiser, because I was interacting with his view of the use of the Old Testament, among others. I was mapping out 4 different approaches to this in evangelical circles, and his was one of them. And so he asked me this question, and we have been in correspondence and have talked when we get together about this issue now for, well over 20 years. And I've developed a good friendship out of it all, even though we don't entirely agree with one another. And it's been a good journey and a good example of scholars interacting with each other on an issue where they rub the edges off one another in the good sense of the term.